Welcome to this video about pragmatism and evidence-based education from the Swansea University Medical School. In this video, we're going to talk a bit more about our model of pragmatic evidence-based education that forms the basis for a lot of the things we do in our MSc in medical education. In the model, we consider evidence-based education to happen at the intersection of three streams of information: the most useful evidence, often the most useful research evidence, our judgment about how and when to apply that evidence, and the context in which we're applying it. In this video, I want to talk a lot more about the prefix to the name of the model, pragmatic. What does it mean to be pragmatic, and why have we chosen this prefix, pragmatic? Most models of evidence-based practice talk about the use of the best evidence, the best available evidence. This is very common in clinical practice. The key feature of the best available evidence is often that it is generalizable. Generalizability comes from a number of markers of research quality, and you can often find types of research evidence that inform models of evidence-based practice being mapped onto what we call hierarchies of evidence. At the top of these hierarchies, you'll see things like systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses. And the further down the hierarchy you go, the more subjective the evidence becomes, and therefore the more likely it is to be subject to bias. Now, this sort of evidence, or hierarchy of evidence, is very common in clinical practice where we have a lot of systematic meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials and so on. It's less common in education. We do have systematic reviews of these sorts of trials, and the data from these we consider to be in many ways generalizable. This sort of evidence are things we focused on in other videos. However, the majority of the research evidence generated by studies in education isn't really generalizable in the way that these systematic reviews and meta-analyses are, in part because the majority of the research evidence doesn't take that form. To make it useful then, we have to go a bit beyond generalizability. The best place for us to do that, or the best place to start, is to think a bit more about what generalizability means. Very simplistically, generalizability means that what's true in one context is true in another. So if you take, say, some clinical guidelines for practice that are based upon systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials, one of the major purposes of those is that if you take those findings which are generated in other contexts by other people and apply them yourself in your own context, the hope is you would find broadly similar results, i.e. what's true in one context is true in another. To understand that properly, we do have to think a little bit about what it means to say that something is true. And here then, we need to start to move into questions of philosophy. Take the following statement. Oxygen is required for human life. Is it something that you would consider to be true? Most of us would, because it is an observable fact that can be empirically proved. There are lots of sort of facts like this in the physical and life sciences. We hope to try and generate facts like this from studies involving meta-analyses and education research. And we do have some generalizable findings as we discussed elsewhere. But if you take a finding from studies like this, let's say the finding that open questions improve learning, could we say, hand on heart and honestly, that that is a true fact? Is it always true in all contexts of all learners, of all open-ended questions? The answer is it's probably not. If we then take a step back into philosophy, this leads us into questions of what it means to say something is true, what it means to say what knowledge is, and what reality is, and so on. There are lots of different branches of what we call epistemology: positivism, post-positivism, and many others listed below. If we go back to our fact about oxygen, oxygen is required for human life. That is a statement we would consider to be derived from a positivist philosophy, or a positivist position on epistemology. It's something that is verifiable, empirically true, and can be demonstrated repeatedly. If we take our statements of generalizable facts from education research, the one about open-ended questions improving learning, it's not really true to say that this is a positivist statement. It's not something that's always empirically correct and is always the same. Therefore, we have to take a different epistemological position when we're considering the truth of this statement. Now, epistemology is something that underpins lots of very important and interesting questions in educational practice and educational research. There are people that spend a lot of time considering the epistemological positions of those types of research. There are other people who think it's very important to take a stance. What sort of epistemology are you gunning for when you're generating educational research findings? What are the sorts of truths that we want to generate from findings in education research? Now, this is something that a lot of people spend a lot of time getting very heat up about. Some people spend a lot of time arguing about whether we can and should generate positivist findings in education research, whether we need to define an epistemological position before we undertake any education research, and what that epistemological position is. Here there is where we start to identify one of the major benefits of pragmatism. Pragmatism considers all of those philosophical and other questions and takes the basic position that it doesn't matter. What matters to pragmatism are the concrete consequences of an action, concrete consequences, the usefulness of research findings. Pragmatism is then a philosophy, it's an approach to research, and it's also an approach to practice, and that's the main way in which we're using it here. No matter which way we approach pragmatism, there's one defining feature that it has in common, best summed up in this quote from one of the originators of the philosophy, William James. William James gave a whole series of lectures in which he defined pragmatism and what it meant. And this is a quote taken from there. It's astonishing to see how many philosophical disputes collapse into insignificance the moment you subject them to a simple test of tracing a concrete consequence. This can be used to sum up pragmatism, can be distilled down really into one simple word. Is it useful? Is the research evidence useful? Are the findings useful? This is why then, rather than best evidence in our model of evidence-based education, we have the most useful research evidence. However, we do then set ourselves up for a whole different set of questions. What does it mean to say that something is useful? Now, there are two different ways we can approach this. The first is to say whether or not a piece of research evidence is generally useful. Some markers we can use for this are to say, has it been done well? And some markers of research that has been done well is research that follows standard reporting outcomes, that are markers of taking a particular research methodology and doing it properly. There are also instruments we can use to appraise the quality of pieces of research, and we're going to look at some of those in other videos. They take basic markers of good and indifferent research and assess them overall and can apply a score or a basic rating to determine whether a piece of research has been done properly, whether it's been done well, and that of course will influence how useful it is. But there's perhaps a more complicated consideration of whether or not a piece of research is useful, and that's whether it's useful to me as a practitioner, whether it's useful to you, the individual, in your context for the specific needs that you want it for. There are lots of questions that people ask themselves when trying to find out whether or not a piece of research is useful. Is it better than what I already do? Is it something that's compatible with what I already do? And can I try it out? Are there ways in which I can play with it and see if it works for me? Have I got the resources, skills and experience to apply this particular piece of evidence or these research findings in my particular context? This then takes us all the way back to our model of pragmatic evidence-based education, and a key component of it, the application of educated judgment about the usefulness of the evidence and when and how to apply it. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're an educator who's involved in what we call bedside teaching sessions. These are teaching sessions that generally involve a patient or service user, an educator, that's you, and a student. They can be in primary care, secondary care, in a pharmacy, wherever. You're involved in that teaching, you're teaching the students, and you need to give them feedback on how they've got on in those bedside teaching encounters. And for whatever reason, you want to improve the way in which you give the feedback, the way in which the students engage with the feedback. Under a traditional model of evidence-based practice, you might then look for some generalizable evidence around feedback. And to be fair, there is a lot of it out there. But as I said earlier, the vast majority of education research doesn't really follow a format that allows it to be generalizable. In fact, some of it's designed not to be generalizable. Lots of research uses what we call qualitative inquiry. Methods that include things like focus groups, interviews, and ethnography. These are rich, deep, and contextual studies that generate rich, deep, complex, and contextual data. Therefore, the data from these studies has limited generalizability, and in many ways they're designed to be rooted in the context in which they're undertaken. There's also a huge amount of education research that's based upon opinion surveys. We ask students, how was it for you? Did you like it? Did you engage with it? We might ask educators the same thing. There are over 10,000 education research studies published every year, and the vast majority of them, as I said, aren't systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials or even randomized controlled trials. A lot of them are the sorts of methods that you see in front of you, or other methods that are very low on a traditional hierarchy of evidence. So let's say you went to the evidence. Because it's feedback, there are some generalizable meta-analyses or systematic reviews around feedback, and this is one of the most highly cited of those by John Hattie and Helen Timperley. They reviewed many different studies on feedback in many different settings and came up with a range of effect sizes that influenced the success of the feedback and how it impacted on students' learning, and you might derive something very useful from reviewing this evidence. However, you might also find something useful, and again this is the key word, useful, from an ethnographic study that looked at feedback given during bedside teaching encounters. This is a type of evidence that would traditionally be very low on a hierarchy of evidence, in part because it's not generalizable, in part because it's so contextually based. But because the context in which this research was undertaken is so similar to ours, and it addresses some needs and questions that are so similar to the ones that we're trying to understand, it becomes then useful for us as education practitioners. Now we can extend this a little bit further to a particular type of evidence that we all use, although in some cases we might not always like to admit it. Where we're trying out something for the first time, and we're very inexperienced or there's a particular problem, or even when we're just trying to tweak something to improve it, the first thing that a lot of us do is we ask a colleague for their opinion. We ask for their experience and their judgment about how we should do it. Now from a pragmatic perspective, this also counts as evidence. But there is a risk with applying pragmatism that we end up all the way back where we started with a very traditional model of education where we just do things the way that people told us to do, and the way that people tell us to do it is based upon how they were taught, which is based upon how they were taught, handed down generation after generation. Nothing ever changes and nothing ever improves. The key thing then with our model is to bring it back to these three streams of information. No matter what it is we're trying to do in education, I am certain that there is going to be some education research evidence out there that is useful for us. We could take that and combine it with our judgment and the context in which we're trying to apply it to come up with a pragmatic, evidence-based model of education that goes beyond mere opinion, but takes all of the research evidence out there as useful and applies it in a pragmatic way. These then are some of the references that we've cited in this video, and if you have any questions about it, just send me an email. That's my email address right there. Okay, see you in the next video.